Some Haunted Houses by Ambrose Bierce. Number 1. The Isle of Pines. For many years there lived near the town of Galapagos, Ohio, an old man named Herman de Luce. Very little was known of his history, for he would neither speak of it himself nor suffer others. It was a common belief among his neighbours that he had been a pirate. If upon any better evidence than his collection of boarding pikes, cutlasses, and ancient flintlock pistols, no one knew. He lived entirely alone in a small house of 4 rooms, falling rapidly into decay and never repaired further than was required by the weather. It stood on a slight elevation in the midst of a large stony field overgrown with brambles, and cultivated in patches and only in the most primitive way. It was his only visible property, but could hardly have yielded him a living, simple and few as were his wants. He seemed always to have ready money, and paid cash for all his purchases at the village stores round about, seldom buying more than 2 or 3 times at the same place until after the lapse of considerable time. He got no commendation, however, for this equitable distribution of his patronage. People were disposed to regard it as an ineffectual attempt to conceal his possession of so much money. That he had great hoards of ill-gotten gold buried somewhere about his tumble-down dwelling was not reasonably to be doubted by any honest soul conversant with the facts of local tradition, and gifted with a sense of the fitness of things. On the 9th of November 1867, the old man died. At least, his dead body was discovered on the 10th, and physicians testified that death had occurred about 24 hours previously. Precisely how, they were unable to say, for the post-mortem examination showed every organ to be absolutely healthy, with no indication of disorder or violence. According to them, death must have taken place about noonday, yet the body was found in bed. The verdict of the coroner's jury was that he came to his death by a visitation of God. The body was buried, and the public administrator took charge of the estate. A rigorous search disclosed nothing more than was already known about the dead man, and much patient excavation here and there about the premises by thoughtful and thrifty neighbours went unrewarded. The administrator locked up the house against the time when the property, real and personal, should be sold by law with a view to defraying, partly, the expenses of the sale. The night of November the 20th was boisterous. A furious gale stormed across the country, scourging it with desolating drifts of sleet. Great trees were torn from the earth and hurled across the roads. So wild a night had never been known in all that region, but one morning the storm had blown itself out of breath, and day dawned bright and clear. At about 8 o'clock that morning, the Reverend Henry Galbraith, a well-known and highly esteemed Lutheran minister, arrived on foot at his house, 1.5 miles from the de Luce place. Mr. Galbraith had been for a month in Cincinnati. He had come up the river in a steamboat, and landing at Gallipolis the previous evening, had immediately obtained a horse and buggy and set out for home. The violence of the storm had delayed him overnight, and in the morning the fallen trees had compelled him to abandon his conveyance and continue his journey afoot. "But where did you pass the night?" inquired his wife, after he had briefly related his adventure. "With old de Luce at the Isle of Pines," was the laughing reply, "and a glum enough time I had of it. He made no objection to my remaining, but not a word could I get out of him." Fortunately, for the interests of Trudy, there was present at this conversation Mr. Robert Moseley Maron, a lawyer and literature of Columbus, the same who wrote the delightful Mellowcraft papers. Noting, but apparently not sharing, the astonishment caused by Mr. Galbraith's answer, this ready-witted person checked by a gesture the exclamations that would naturally have followed, and tranquilly inquired, How came you to go in there?" This is Mr. Merrin's version of Mr. Galbraith's reply. "I saw a light moving about the house, and being nearly blinded by the sleet, and half frozen besides, drove in at the gate and put up my horse in the old rail stable where it is now. I then rapped at the door, and getting no invitation, went in without one. The room was dark, but having matches, I found a candle and lit it. I tried to enter the adjoining room, but the door was fast, and though I heard the old man's heavy footsteps in there, he made no response to my calls. There was no fire in the hearth, so I made one, and lying down before it with my overcoat under my head, prepared myself for sleep. Pretty soon the door that I had tried silently opened, and the old man came in carrying a candle. I spoke to him pleasantly, apologizing for my intrusion, but he took no notice of me. He seemed to be searching for something, though his eyes were unmoved in their sockets. I wonder if he ever walks in his sleep. He took a circuit, a part of the way around the room, and went out the same way as he'd come in. Twice more before I slept, he came back into the room, acting precisely the same way and departing as at first. In the intervals, I heard him tramping all over the house, his footsteps distinctly audible in the pauses of the storm. When I woke in the morning, he'd already gone out." Mr. Merrin attempted some further questioning, but was unable longer to restrain the family's tongues. The story of Deluce's death and burial came out, greatly to the good minister's astonishment. "The explanation of your adventure is very simple," said Mr. Merrin. "I don't believe old Deluce walks in his sleep, not in his present one, but you evidently dream in yours." And to this view of the matter Mr. Galbraith was compelled reluctantly to assent. Nevertheless, a late hour of the next night found these two gentlemen, accompanied by a son of the minister, in the road in front of the old Deluce house. There was a light inside, and it appeared now at one window and then at another. The three men advanced to the door. Just as they reached it, there came from the interior a confusion of the most appalling sounds, the clash of weapons, steel against steel, sharp explosions as of firearms, shrieks of women, groans, and the curses of men in combat. The investigators stood a moment, irresolute and frightened. Then Mr. Galbraith tried the door. It was fast. But the minister was a man of courage, a man, moreover, of Herculean strength. He retired a pace or two and rushed against the door, striking it with his right shoulder and bursting it from the frame with a loud crash. In a moment the three were inside. Darkness and silence. The only sound was the beating of their hearts. Mr. Merrin had provided himself with matches and a candle. With some difficulty, begotten of his excitement, he made a light, and they proceeded to explore the place, passing from room to room. Everything was in orderly arrangement, as it had been left by the sheriff. Nothing had been disturbed. A light coating of dust was everywhere. A back door was partly open, as if by neglect, and their first thought was that the authors of the awful revelry might have escaped. The door was opened, and the light of the candle shone through upon the ground. The expiring effort of the previous night's storm had been a light fall of snow, yet there were no footprints. The white surface was unbroken. They closed the door and entered the last room of the four that the house contained, that farthest from the road, in an angle of the building. Here the candle in Mr. Merrin's hand was suddenly extinguished as by a draught of air. Almost immediately followed the sound of a heavy fall. When the candle had been hastily relighted, young Mr. Galbraith was seen prostrate on the floor at a little distance from the others. He was dead. In one hand the body grasped a heavy sack of coins. which later examination showed to be all of old Spanish mintage. Directly over the body as it lay, a board had been torn from its fastenings in the wall, and from the cavity so disclosed, it was evident that the bag had been taken. Another inquest was held. Another post-mortem examination failed to reveal a probable cause of death. Another verdict of the visitation of God left all at liberty to form their own conclusions. Mr. Marin contended that the young man died of excitement. Number 2. A fruitless assignment. Henry Saylor, who was killed in Covington in a quarrel with Antonio Finch, was a reporter on the Cincinnati Commercial. In the year 1859, a vacant dwelling in Vine Street in Cincinnati became the centre of a local excitement because of the strange sights and sounds said to be observed in it nightly. According to the testimony of many reputable residents of the vicinity, these were inconsistent with any other hypothesis than that the house was haunted. Figures with something singularly unfamiliar about them were seen by crowds on the sidewalk to pass in and out. No one could say just where they appeared upon the open lawn on their way to the front door by which they entered, nor at exactly what point they vanished as they came out. Or, rather, while each spectator was positive enough about these matters, no two agreed. They were all similarly at variance in their descriptions of the figures themselves. Some of the bolder of the curious throng ventured on several evenings to stand upon the doorsteps to intercept them, or failing in this, get a nearer look at them. These courageous men, it was said, were unable to force the door by their united strength, and were always hurled from the steps by some invisible agency and severely injured. The door immediately afterward opening, apparently of its own volition, to admit or free some ghostly guest. The dwelling was known as the Roscoe House, a family of that name having lived there for some years, and then, one by one, disappeared, the last to leave being an old woman. Stories of foul play and successive murders had always been rife, but were never authenticated. One day, during the prevalence of the excitement, Saylor presented himself at the office of the Commercial for orders. He received a note from the city editor which read as follows: "Go and pass the night alone in the haunted house in Vine Street, and if anything occurs worthwhile, make 2 columns." Saylor obeyed his superior. He couldn't afford to lose his position on the paper. Appraising the police of his intentions, he effected an entrance through a rear window before dark, walked through the deserted rooms, bare of furniture, dusty and desolate, and seating himself at last in the parlour on an old sofa, which he had dragged in from another room, watched the deepening of the gloom as night came on. Before it was altogether dark, the curious crowd had collected in the street, silent, as a rule, and expectant, with here and there a scoffer uttering his incredulity and courage with scornful remarks or ribald cries. None knew of the anxious watcher inside. He feared to make a light. The uncurtained windows would have betrayed his presence, subjecting him to insult, possibly to injury. Moreover, he was too conscientious to do anything to enfeeble his impressions, and unwilling to alter any of the customary conditions under which the manifestations were said to occur. It was now dark outside, but light from the street faintly illuminated the part of the room that he was in. He had set open every door in the whole interior, above and below, but all the outer ones were locked and bolted. Sudden exclamations from the crowd caused him to spring to the window and look out. He saw the figure of a man moving rapidly across the lawn towards the building, saw it ascend the steps, then a projection of the wall concealed it. There was a noise as of the opening and closing of the hall door. He heard quick, heavy footsteps along the passage, heard them ascend the stairs, heard them on the uncarpeted floor of the chamber immediately overhead. Saylor promptly drew his pistol. and groping his way up the stairs entered the chamber, dimly lighted from the street. Nobody was there. He heard footsteps in an adjoining room and entered that. It was dark and silent. He struck his foot against some object on the floor, knelt by it, passed his hand over it. It was a human head, that of a woman. Lifting it by the hair, this iron-nerved man returned to the half-lighted room below, carried it near the window, and attentively examined it. While so engaged, he was half conscious of the rapid opening and closing of the outer door, of footfalls sounding all around him. He raised his eyes from the ghastly object of his attention, and saw himself the centre of a crowd of men and women, dimly seen. The room was thronged with them. He thought the people had broken in. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said coolly, "you see me under suspicious circumstances, but..." His voice was drowned in peals of laughter. Such laughter as is heard in asylums for the insane. The persons about him pointed at the object in his hand, and their merriment increased as he dropped it, and it went rolling among their feet. They danced about it with gestures grotesque and attitudes obscene and indescribable. They struck it with their feet, urging it about the room from wall to wall, pushed and overthrew one another in their struggles to kick it, cursed and screamed and sang snatches of ribald songs as the battered head bounded around the room, as if in terror and trying to escape. At last it shot out of the door into the hall, followed by all, with tumultuous haste. That moment the door closed with a sharp concussion. Sailor was alone, in dead silence. Carefully putting away his pistol, which all the time he had held in his hand, he went to a window and looked out. The street was deserted and silent. The lamps were extinguished. The roofs and chimneys of the houses were sharply outlined against the dawn light in the east. He left the house, the door yielding easily to his hand, and walked to the commercial office. The city editor was still in his office, asleep. Sailor waked him and said, "I've been at the haunted house." The editor stared blankly, as if not wholly awake. "Good God!" he cried. "Are you Sailor?" "Yes, why not?" The editor made no answer, but continued staring. "I passed the night there, it seems," said Sailor. "They say that things were uncommonly quiet out there," the editor said, trifling with a paperweight upon which he had dropped his eyes. "Did anything occur?" "Nothing whatsoever." Number 3. A vine on a house. About 3 miles from the little town of Norton, Missouri, on the road leading to Maysville, stands an old house that was last occupied by a family named Harding. Since 1886, no one had lived in it, nor is anyone likely to live in it again. Time and the disfavour of persons dwelling thereabout are converting it into a rather picturesque ruin. An observer unacquainted with its history would hardly put it into the category of haunted houses, yet in all the region round such is its evil reputation. Its windows are without glass, its doorways without doors. There are wide breaches in the shingle roof, and for lack of paint, the weatherboarding is a dun grey. But these unfailing signs of the supernatural are partly concealed and greatly softened by the abundant foliage of a large vine overrunning the entire structure. This vine, of a species which no botanist had ever been able to name, has an important part in the story of the house. The Harding family consisted of Robert Harding, his wife Matilda, Miss Julia Went, who was her sister, and 2 young children. Robert Harding was a silent, cold-mannered man who made no friends in the neighbourhood, and apparently cared to make none. He was about 40 years old, frugal and industrious, and made a living from the little farm, which is now overgrown with brush and brambles. He and his sister-in-law were rather tabooed by their neighbours, who seemed to think that they were seen too frequently together. Not entirely their fault, for at these times they evidently did not challenge observation. The moral code of rural Missouri is stern and exacting. Mrs. Harding was a gentle, sad-eyed woman lacking a left foot. At some time in 1884, it became known that she had gone to visit her mother in Iowa. That was what her husband said in reply to inquiries, and his manner of saying it did not encourage further questioning. She never came back, and 2 years later, without selling his farm or anything that was his, or appointing an agent to look after his interests, or removing his household goods, Harding, with the rest of the family, left the country. Nobody knew whither he went. Nobody at the time cared. Naturally, whatever was movable about the place soon disappeared, and the deserted house became haunted in the manner of its kind. One summer evening 4 or 5 years later, the Reverend J. Gruber of Norton and a Maysville attorney named Hyatt met on horseback in front of the Harding place, having business matters to discuss. They hitched their animals and going to the house sat on the porch to talk. Some humorous reference to the sombre reputation of the place was made and forgotten as soon as uttered, and they talked of their business affairs until it grew almost dark. The evening was oppressively warm, the air stagnant. Presently, both men started from their seats in surprise. A long vine that covered half the front of the house and dangled its branches from the edge of the porch above them was visibly and audibly agitated, shaking violently in every stem and leaf. "We shall have a storm," Hyatt exclaimed. Gruber said nothing, but silently directed the other's attention to the foliage of adjacent trees, which showed no movement. Even the delicate tips of the boughs silhouetted against the clear sky were completely motionless. They hastily passed down the steps to what had been a lawn and looked upward at the vine, whose entire length was now visible. It continued in violent agitation, yet they could discern no disturbing cause. "Let us leave," said the minister, and leave they did. Forgetting that they had been travelling in opposite directions, they rode away together. They went to Norton, where they related their strange experience to several discreet friends. The next evening, at about the same hour, accompanied by 2 others whose names were not recalled, they were again on the porch of the Harding house, and again the mysterious phenomenon occurred. The vine was violently agitated while under the closest scrutiny from root to tip. Nor did their combined strength, applied to the trunk, serve to still it. After an hour's observation they retreated, no less wise, it is thought, than when they had come. No great time was required for these singular facts to rouse the curiosity of the entire neighbourhood. By day and by night crowds of persons assembled at the Harding house, seeking a sign. It does not appear that they found it, yet so credible were the witnesses mentioned that none doubted the reality of the manifestations to which they testified. By either a happy inspiration or some destructive design, it was one day proposed, nobody appeared to know from whom the suggestion came, to dig up the vine. And after a good deal of debate, this was done. Nothing was found but the root, yet nothing could have been more strange. For 5 or 6 feet from the trunk, which had at the surface of the ground a diameter of several inches, it ran downward, single and straight, into a loose friable earth. Then it divided and subdivided into rootlets, fibres and filaments, most curiously interwoven. When carefully freed from the soil, they showed a singular formation. In their ramifications and doublings back upon themselves, they made a compact network, having in size and shape an amazing resemblance to a human figure. Head, trunk, and limbs were there. Even the fingers and toes were distinctly defined, and many professed to see in the distribution and arrangement of the fibres in the globular mass representing the head a grotesque suggestion of a face. The figure was horizontal. The smaller roots had begun to untie at the breast. In point of resemblance to the human form, this image was imperfect. At about 10 inches from one of the knees, the scilla forming that leg had abruptly doubled backward and inward upon their course of growth. The figure lacked a left foot. There was but one inference, the obvious one, but in the ensuing excitement as many courses of action were proposed as there were incapable counsellors. the matter was settled by the sheriff of the county, who, as the lawful custodian of the abandoned estate, ordered the root replaced and the excavation filled with the earth that had been removed. Later inquiry brought only one fact of relevancy and significance. Mrs. Harding had never visited her relatives in Iowa, nor did they know that she was supposed to have done so. Of Robert Harding and the rest of his family, nothing is known. The house retains its evil reputation, but the replanted vine is as orderly and well-behaved a vegetable as a nervous person could wish to sit under of a pleasant night, when the katydids grate out their immemorial revelation, and the distant whippoorwill signifies his notion of what ought to be done about it. Number 4. At Old Man Eckert's. Philip Eckert lived for many years in an old weather-stained wooden house about 3 miles from the little town of Marion in Vermont. There must be quite a number of persons living who remember him, not unkindly, I trust, and know something of the story I am about to tell. Old Man Eckert, as he was always called, was not of a sociable disposition and lived alone. As he was never known to speak of his own affairs, nobody thereabout knew anything of his past, nor of his relatives, if he had any. Without being particularly ungracious or repellent in the manner of speech, he managed somehow to be immune to impertinent curiosity, yet exempt from the evil repute with which it commonly revenges itself when baffled. So far as I know, Mr. Eckert's renown as a reformed assassin or a retired pirate of the Spanish Main had not reached any ear in Marion. He got his living cultivating a small, not very fertile farm. One day he disappeared, and a prolonged search by his neighbours failed to turn him up, or throw any light upon his whereabouts or whyabouts. Nothing indicated preparation to leave. All was as he might have left it to go to the spring for a bucket of water. For a few weeks little else was talked of in that region. Then Old Man Eckert became a village tale for the ear of the stranger. I do not know what was done regarding his property. The correct legal tilling, doubtless. The house was standing, still vacant and conspicuously unfit when last I had heard of it, some 20 years afterwards. Of course, it came to be considered haunted, and the customary tales were told of moving lights, dolorous sounds, and startling apparitions. At one time, about 5 years after the disappearance, these stories of the supernatural became so rife, or through some attesting circumstances seemed so important, that some of Marion's most serious citizens deemed it well to investigate, and to that end arranged for a night session on the premises. The parties to this undertaking were John Holcomb, an apothecary, Wilson Merle, a lawyer, and Andreas C. Palmer, the teacher of the public school, all men of consequence and repute. They were to meet at Holcomb's house at 8 o'clock in the evening of the appointed day and go together to the scene of their vigil, where certain arrangements for their comfort, a provision of fuel and the like, for the season was winter, had already been made. Palmer did not keep the engagement, and after waiting a half an hour for him, the others went to the Eckert house without him. They established themselves in the principal room before a glowing fire, and without other light than it gave, awaited events. It had been agreed to speak as little as possible. They did not even renew the exchange of views regarding the defection of Palmer, which had occupied their minds on the way. Probably an hour had passed without incident when they heard, not without emotion doubtless, the sound of an opening door in the rear of the house, followed by footfalls in the room adjoining that in which they sat. The watchers rose to their feet, but stood firm, prepared for whatever might ensue. A long silence followed. How long, neither would afterward undertake to say. Then the door between the two rooms opened, and a man entered. It was Palmer. He was pale, as if from excitement, as pale as the others felt themselves to be. His manner, too, was singularly distrait. He neither responded to their salutations, nor so much as looked at them, but walked slowly across the room in the light of the failing fire, and opened the front door, then passed out into the darkness. It seems to have been the first thought of both men that Palmer was suffering from fright, that something seen, heard, or imagined in the back room had deprived him of his senses. Acting on the same friendly impulse, both ran after him through the open door, but neither they, nor anyone, ever again saw or heard of Andreas Palmer. This much was ascertained the next morning, during the session of Messrs. Holcomb and Merle at the haunted house. A new snow had fallen to a depth of several inches upon the old. In this snow, Palmer's trail from his lodging in the village to the back door of the Eckert house was conspicuous, but there it ended. From the front door nothing led away but the tracks of the two men who swore he preceded them. Palmer's disappearance was as complete as that of old man Eckert himself, whom, indeed, the editor of the local paper somewhat graphically accused of having reached out and pulled him in. Number 5. The Spook House. On the road leading north from Manchester in eastern Kentucky to Boonville, 20 miles away, stood, in 1862, a wooden plantation house of a somewhat better quality than most of the dwellings in that region. The house was destroyed by fire in the year following, probably by some stragglers from the retreating column of General George W. Morgan, when he was driven from Cumberland Gap to the Ohio River by General Kirby Smith. At the time of its destruction, it had for 4 or 5 years been vacant. The fields about it were overgrown with brambles, the fences gone, and the workers' quarters and outhouses had generally fallen partly into ruin by neglect and pillage. For the locals of the vicinity found in the building and fences an abundant supply of fuel, of which they availed themselves without hesitation, openly and by daylight, but by daylight alone. After nightfall, no human being except passing strangers ever went near the place. It was known as the Spook House. That it was tenanted by evil spirits, visible, audible, and active, no one in all that region doubted any more than he doubted what he was told of Sundays by the travelling preacher. Its owner's opinion of the matter was unknown. He and his family had disappeared one night, and no trace of them had ever been found. They'd left everything: household goods, clothing, provisions, the horses in the stable, the cows in the field, all as it stood. Nothing was missing except a man, a woman, 3 girls, a boy and a babe. It was not altogether surprising that a plantation where 7 human beings could be simultaneously effaced, and nobody the wiser, should be under some suspicion. One night in June 1859, 2 citizens of Frankfurt, Colonel J.C. McArdle, a lawyer, and Judge Myron Vey of the State Militia, were driving from Boonville to Manchester. Their business was so important that they decided to push on despite the darkness and the mutterings of an approaching storm, which eventually broke on them just as they arrived opposite the Spook House. The lightning was so incessant that they easily found their way through the gateway and into a shed, where they hitched and harnessed their team. They then went to the house, through the rain, and knocked at all the doors without getting any response. Attributing this to the continuous uproar of the thunder, they pushed at one of the doors, which yielded. They entered without further ceremony and closed the door. That instant they were in darkness and silence. Not a gleam of the lightning's unceasing blaze penetrated the windows or crevices, not a whisper of the awful tumult which reached them there. It was as if they had suddenly been stricken blind and deaf, and McArdle afterwards said that for a moment he believed himself to be killed by a stroke of lightning as he crossed the threshold. The rest of this adventure can as well be related in his own words from the Frankfurt Advocate of August the 6th, 1876. When I had somewhat recovered from the dazing effects of the transition from uproar to silence, my first impulse was to reopen the door which I had closed, and from the knob of which I was not conscious of having removed my hand. I felt it distinctly, still in the clasp of my fingers. My notion was to ascertain by stepping again into the storm whether I had been deprived of sight and hearing. I turned the doorknob and pulled open the door. It led to another room. This apartment was suffused with a faint greenish light, the source of which I could not determine. making everything distinctly visible, though nothing was sharply defined. Everything I say, but in truth the only objects within the blank stone walls of that room were human corpses. In number there were perhaps 8 or 10. It may well be understood that I did not truly count them. They were of different ages and range of sizes, from infancy up, and of both sexes. All were prostrate on the floor, excepting one, apparently a young woman, who sat up, her back supported by an angle of the wall. A babe was clasped in the arms of another. A half-grown lad lay face downwards across the legs of a full-bearded man. One or two were nearly naked, and the hand of a young girl held the fragment of a gown which she had torn open at the breast. The bodies were in various stages of decay, all greatly shrunken in face and figure. Some were but little more than skeletons. While I stood stupefied with horror by this ghastly spectacle, and still holding open the door, by some unaccountable perversity my attention was diverted from the shocking scene, and concerned itself with trifles and details. Perhaps my mind, with an instinct of self-preservation, sought relief in matters which would relax its dangerous tension. Among other things, I observed that the door that I was holding open was of heavy iron plates, riveted, equidistant from one another, and from the top and bottom 3 strong bolts protruded from the bevelled edge. I turned the knob, and they were retracted flush with the edge, released it, and they shot out. It was a spring lock. On the inside there was no knob, nor any kind of projection. It was just a smooth surface of iron. While noting these things with an interest and attention which it now astonishes me to recall, I felt myself thrust aside, and Judge Veigh, whom in the intensity and vicissitudes of my feelings I had altogether forgotten, pushed by me into the room. "For God's sake," I cried, "do not go in there. Let us get out of this dreadful place." He gave no heed to my entreaties, but, as fearless a gentleman as lived in all of the South, walked quickly to the centre of the room, knelt beside one of the bodies for a closer examination, and tenderly raised its blackened and shrivelled head in his hands. A strong, disagreeable odour came through the doorway, completely overpowering me. My senses reeled. I felt myself falling, and in clutching at the edge of the door for support, pushed it shut with a sharp click. I remember no more. 6 weeks later I recovered my reason in a hotel at Manchester, whither I had been taken by strangers the next day. For all these weeks I had suffered from a nervous fever, attended with constant delirium. I had been found lying in the road several miles away from the house, but how I had escaped from it to get there I never knew. On recovery, or as soon as my physicians permitted me to talk, I inquired the fate of Judge Veigh, whom, to quiet me as I now know, they represented as well and at home. No one believed a word of my story, and who can wonder, and who can imagine my grief when, arriving at my home in Frankfort 2 months later, I learned that Judge Veigh had never been heard of since that night. I then regretted bitterly the pride which since the first few days after the recovery of my reason had forbidden me to repeat my discredited story and insist upon its truth. With all that afterward occurred, the examination of the house, the failure to find any room corresponding to that which I have described, the attempt to have me adjudged insane, and my triumph over my accusers, the readers of The Advocate are familiar. After all these years, I am still confident that excavations, which I have neither the legal right to undertake nor the wealth to make, would disclose the secret of the disappearance of my unhappy friend, and possibly of the former occupants and owners of the deserted and now destroyed house. I do not despair of yet bringing about such a search, and it is a source of deep grief to me that it has been delayed by the undeserved hostility and unwise incredulity of the family and friends of the late Judge Veigh. Colonel McCardle died in Frankfurt on the 13th day of December in the year 1879. Number 6. The Other Lodgers. "In order to take that train," said Colonel Levering, sitting in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, You will have to remain nearly all night in Atlanta. That is a fine city, but I advise you not to put up at the Balthrit House, one of the principal hotels. It is an old wooden building in urgent need of repairs. There are breaches in the walls that you could throw a cat through. The bedrooms have no locks on the doors, no furniture, but a single chair in each, and a bedstead without bedding, just a mattress. Even these meagre accommodations you cannot be sure that you will have in Monopoly. You must take your chance of being stowed in with a lot of others. Sir, it is a most abominable hotel. The night that I passed in it was an uncomfortable night. I got in late and was shown to my room on the ground floor by an apologetic night clerk with a tallow candle, which he considerately left with me. I was worn out by 2 days and a night of hard railway travel, and had not entirely recovered from a gunshot wound to the head, received in an altercation. Rather than look for better quarters, I lay down on the mattress without removing my clothing and fell asleep. Along toward morning I awoke. The moon had risen and was shining in at the uncurtained windows, illuminating the room with a soft, bluish light, which seemed somehow a bit spooky, though I dare say it had no uncommon quality. All moonlight is that way if you will observe it. Imagine my surprise and indignation when I saw the floor occupied by at least a dozen other lodgers. I sat up, earnestly damning the management of that unlikable hotel, and was about to spring from the bed and go make trouble for the night clerk, him of the apologetic manner and the tallow candle, when something in the situation affected me with a strange indisposition to move. I suppose I was what a story writer might call frozen with terror, for those men were obviously all dead. They lay on their backs, disposed orderly along 3 sides of the room, their feet to the walls. Against the other wall, farthest from the door, stood my bed and the chair. All the faces were covered, but under their white cloths, the features of the 2 bodies that lay in the square patch of moonlight near the window showed in sharp profile to nose to chin. I thought this a bad dream and tried to cry out, as one does in nightmare, but could make no sound. At least, with a desperate effort, I drew my feet to the floor, and passing between the 2 rows of clouted faces and the 2 bodies that lay nearest the door, I escaped from the infernal place and ran to the office. The night clerk was there, behind the desk, sitting in the dim light of another tallow candle, just sitting and staring. He did not rise. My abrupt entrance produced no effect on him, though I must have looked a veritable corpse myself. It occurred to me then that I had not before really observed the fellow. He was a little chap, with a colourless face and the whitest, blankest eyes I ever saw. He had no more expression than the back of my hand. His clothing was a dirty grey. "Damn you," I said, "what do you mean?" Just the same, I was shaking like a leaf in the wind and did not recognise my own voice. The night clerk rose, bowed apologetically, and, well, he was no longer there, and at that moment I felt a hand laid upon my shoulder from behind. Just fancy that if you can. Unspeakably frightened, I turned and saw a portly, kind-faced gentleman who asked, "What is the matter, my friend?" I was not long in telling him, but before I made an end of it, he went pale himself. "See here," he said, "are you telling the truth?" I had now got myself in hand, and terror had given place to indignation. "If you dare to doubt it," I said, "I'll hammer the life out of you." "No," he replied, "don't do that. Just sit down till I tell you. This is not a hotel. It used to be. Afterwards it was a hospital. Now it is unoccupied, waiting a tenant. The room that you mention was the dead room. There was always plenty of dead. The fellow that you call the night clerk used to be that, but later he booked the patients as they were brought in. I don't understand his being here. He's been dead a few weeks." "And who are you?" I blurted out. "Oh, I look after the premises. I happened to be passing just now and seeing a light in here. Came to investigate. Let us have a look into that room," he added, lifting the sputtering candle from the desk. "'Till see you at the devil first," said I, bolting out of the door into the street. "Sir, that Breathitt house in Atlanta is a beastly place. Don't you stop there." "God forbid. Your account of it certainly does not suggest comfort. By the way, Colonel, when did all that occur?" "In September 1864, shortly after the siege." Number 7. The Thing at Nolan. To the south of where the road between Leedsville and Hardy in the state of Missouri crosses the east fork of the May Creek stands an abandoned house. Nobody has lived in it since the summer of 1879, and it is fast going to pieces. For some 3 years before the date mentioned above, it was occupied by the family of Charles May, from one of whose ancestors the creek near which it stands took its name. Mr. May's family consisted of a wife, an adult son, 2 young girls. The son's name was John. The names of the daughters are unknown to the writers of this sketch. John May was of a morose and surly disposition, not easily moved to anger, but having an uncommon gift of sullen, implacable hate. His father was quite otherwise, of a sunny, jovial disposition, but with a quick temper like a sudden flame kindled in a wisp of straw, which consumes it in a flash, and is no more. He cherished no resentments, and his anger gone, was quick to make overtures for reconciliation. He had a brother living nearby, who was unlike him in respect of all of this, and it was a current witticism in the neighbourhood that John had inherited his disposition from his uncle. One day, a misunderstanding arose between father and son. Harsh words ensued, and the father struck the son full in the face with his fist. John quietly wiped away the blood that followed the blow, fixed his eyes upon the already penitent offender, and said with cold composure, "You will die for that." The words were overheard by 2 brothers named Jackson, who were approaching the men at the moment. But seeing them engaged in a quarrel, they retired, apparently unobserved. Charles May afterward related the unfortunate occurrence to his wife, and explained that he had apologised to the son for the hasty blow, but without avail. The young man not only rejected his overtures, but refused to withdraw his terrible threat. Nevertheless, there was no open rupture of relations. John continued living with the family, and things went on very much as before. One Sunday morning in June 1879, about 2 weeks after what has been related, May Sr. left the house immediately after breakfast, taking a spade. He said he was going to make an excavation at a certain spring in a wood about a mile away, so that the cattle could obtain water. John remained in the house for some hours, variously occupied in shaving himself, writing letters, and reading a newspaper. His manner was very nearly what it usually was. Perhaps he was a trifle more sullen and surly. At 2 o'clock he left the house. At 5 he returned. For some reason not connected with any interest in his movements, and which is not now recalled, the time of his departure and that of his return were noted by his mother and sisters, as were attested at his trial for murder. It was observed that his clothing was wet in spots, as if, so the prosecution afterward pointed out, he had been removing blood stains from it. His manner was strange, his look wild. He complained of illness, and going to his room, took to his bed. May Sr. did not return. Later that evening, the nearest neighbours were aroused, and during that night and the following day, a search was prosecuted through the wood where the spring was. It resulted in little but the discovery of both men's footprints in the clay about the spring. John May, in the meantime, had grown rapidly worse with what the local physician called brain fever, and in his delirium raved of murder, but did not say whom he conceived to have been murdered, nor whom he imagined to have done the deed. But his threat was recalled by the brothers Jackson, and he was arrested on suspicion, and a deputy sheriff put in charge of him at his home. Public opinion rang strongly against him, and but for his illness he would probably have been hanged by a mob. As it was, a meeting of the neighbours was held on Tuesday, and a committee appointed to watch the case and take such action at any time as circumstances might seem to warrant. On Wednesday, all was changed. From the town of Nolan, 8 miles away, came a story which put a quite different light on the matter. Nolan consisted of a schoolhouse, a blacksmith shop, a store, and half a dozen dwellings. The store was kept by one Henry Odell, a cousin of the elder May. On the afternoon of the Sunday of May's disappearance, Mr. Odell and 4 of his neighbours, men of credibility, were sitting in the store smoking and talking. It was a warm day, and both the front and the back door were open. At about 3 o'clock, Charles May, who was well known to the 3 of them, entered at the front door and passed out at the rear. He did not look at them, nor return their greeting, a circumstance which did not surprise, for he was evidently seriously hurt. Above the left eyebrow was a wound, a deep gash from which the blood flowed, covering the whole left side of his face and neck, and saturating his light grey shirt. Oddly enough, the thought uppermost in the minds of all was that he'd been fighting, and was going to the brook directly at the back of the store to wash himself. Perhaps there was a feeling of delicacy, a backwoods etiquette, which restrained them from following him to offer assistance. The court records, from which mainly this narrative is drawn, are silent as to anything but the fact that they waited for him to return, but he did not. Bordering the brook behind the store is a forest extending for 6 miles back to the Medicine Lodge Hills. As soon as it became known in the neighbourhood of the missing man's dwelling that he had been seen in Nolan, there was a marked alteration in public sentiment and feeling. The Vigilance Committee went out of existence without the formality of a resolution. Search along the wooded bottomlands of May Creek was stopped, and nearly the entire male population of the region took to beating the bush around Nolan and in the Medicine Lodge Hills, but of the missing man no trace was ever found. One of the strangest circumstances of this strange case is the formal indictment and trial of a man for murder, of one whose body no human being professed to have seen. We are all more or less familiar with the vagaries and eccentricities of frontier law, but this instance, it is thought, is unique. However that may be, it is a record that in recovering from his illness, John May was indicted for the murder of his missing father. Counsel for the defence appears not to have demurred, and the case was tried on its merits. The prosecution was spiritless and perfunctory. The defence easily established, with regard to the deceased, an alibi. If during the time in which John May must have killed Charles May, if he killed him at all, Charles May was miles away from where John May must have been, it is plain that the deceased must have come to his death at the hands of another. John May was acquitted, immediately left the county, and has never been heard on from that day. Shortly afterward, his mother and sisters removed to St. Louis, the farm having passed into the possession of a man who owns the land adjoining, and has a dwelling of his own. The May house has ever since been vacant, and has the sombre reputation of being haunted. One day after May family had left the county, some boys playing in the woods along May Creek found concealed under a mass of dead leaves, but partly exposed by the rooting of hogs, a spade, nearly new and bright, except for a spot on one edge, which was rusted and stained with blood. The implements had the initials CM cut into the handle. This discovery renewed, in some degree, the public excitement of a few months before. The earth near the spot where the spade was found was carefully examined, and the result was the finding of the dead body of a man. It had been buried under 2 or 3 feet of soil, and the spot covered with a layer of dead leaves and twigs. There was but little decomposition, a fact attributed to some preservative property in the mineral-bearing soil. Above the left eyebrow was a wound, a deep gash from which blood had flowed, covering the whole left side of the face and neck, and saturating the light grey shirt. The skull had been cut through by the blow. The body was that of Charles May. But what was it that passed through Mr. Odell's store at Nolan? The end.